There is a leather journal in the Alabama State Archives that no one was allowed to read for 127 years. When historians finally opened it, 3 of them requested immediate transfers to different departments. The journal belonged to a doctor who had been called to a plantation outside Selma in 1847. And what he documented there was so disturbing that he wrote on the first page, "May God forgive me for not burning this. But someone must know what I witnessed, even if that knowledge comes a century after my death." The plantation was called Willowmere. The woman who owned it was named Elizabeth Crane. And what she created there was not just slavery. It was something worse, something that turned the already obscene logic of human bondage into a calculated nightmare that destroyed everyone it touched, including her own children. On the banks of the Alabama River, Elizabeth Crane was orchestrating a breeding program that used her own sons as instruments. She kept meticulous records. She tracked bloodlines like a horse breeder. She separated families, forced unions between blood relatives, and built a system so methodical that even other plantation owners whispered about it in horrified fascination. But they never stopped her. Because in Alabama, enslaved people were not human beings under the law. They were property, and what you did with your property was your own business. What makes this story particularly haunting is that Elizabeth Crane was not some sadistic monster who enjoyed cruelty. She was worse than that. She was a businesswoman who saw human beings as inventory, who calculated profit in children's lives, and who convinced herself that what she was doing was not just acceptable but innovative. She called it improvement. She called it efficiency. She called it the future of Southern agriculture. What she never called it was what it actually was: a crime against humanity so profound that the very earth at Willowmere seemed cursed by it. Before we go deeper into this darkness, understand something. This is not entertainment. This is testimony. These were real people who suffered in ways that should make us sick to remember. The comfortable lies we tell ourselves about history require the truth as their antidote. The story begins not with Elizabeth Crane but with her husband's death and with the debt he left behind that would cost dozens of people their lives and their humanity. Willowmere Plantation occupied 8,400 acres along the Alabama River about 12 miles south of Selma in Dallas County. The land was good black soil that grew cotton like the river itself was pumping wealth directly into the ground. Colonel Marcus Crane had purchased the property with money inherited from his father's shipping business in Savannah. Willowmere was producing hundreds of bales of cotton annually, and Marcus Crane was one of the most respected planters in Dallas County. He married Elizabeth Thornton. She was 17 years old, the daughter of a failed banker from Montgomery who had lost everything in a financial panic. The marriage was strategic on both sides. Marcus needed a wife to manage his household and produce heirs. Elizabeth needed escape from poverty and the social death that came with her father's bankruptcy. They made a practical arrangement, and for 20 years it functioned adequately if not warmly. Elizabeth bore Marcus 6 children. 3 survived infancy: 2 sons, Jonathan and Samuel, and 1 daughter, Mary. The children were raised in the rigid formality of plantation aristocracy. They learned French from a hired tutor. They studied scripture under their father's supervision. They understood from earliest childhood that they were superior to the enslaved people who surrounded them. Marcus Crane died. He had been riding the property line when his horse stumbled in a gully. Marcus fell, struck his head on a rock, and never regained consciousness. The funeral was well attended. Neighboring planters spoke warmly of his integrity, his business acumen, his devotion to the Southern way of life. They offered Elizabeth their support and assistance. They assured her that managing Willowmere would be challenging, but that with proper guidance from male relatives or a competent overseer, she would manage. What none of them knew, what Elizabeth herself did not fully understand until the lawyer read Marcus's will, was that Willowmere was drowning in debt. Marcus had borrowed extensively to expand his land holdings. He had purchased additional enslaved people on credit. He had made investments in Alabama railroads that had collapsed spectacularly. On paper, Willowmere was worth a fortune. But Marcus owed enormous sums to creditors with notes coming due over the next 4 years. Elizabeth sat in the lawyer's office in Selma, listening to numbers that represented catastrophe. She was 38 years old, a widow with 3 children, and a plantation that was essentially collateral for debts she had no way to pay. Selling Willowmere would barely cover what was owed. She would be left with nothing. No home, no income, no social standing. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "there may be options. If you could increase production significantly, pay down the notes as they come due, you might retain ownership, but that would require substantial increases in output without additional capital investment. It would require," he paused, "maximum efficiency from your existing resources." Elizabeth understood what he meant. She needed to make her enslaved population more productive without buying additional workers. She needed to extract more labor, more value, more profit from the people Marcus had owned, the people she now owned, and she needed to grow that number without spending money on purchases. There was only one way to do that: breeding. Most plantations experienced what owners called natural increase. Enslaved women had children. Those children eventually became workers. It was slow, but over decades it grew the labor force. But Elizabeth did not have decades. She had 4 years before the largest note came due. She needed rapid increase, systematic increase. She needed to turn reproduction into an industrial process. The idea did not come to her fully formed. It developed over months as she studied the plantation ledgers, as she calculated profit margins, as she lay awake at night doing arithmetic that traded human dignity for financial survival. She began tracking the women at Willowmere, noting their ages, their health, their fertility. She separated out the youngest and strongest women. She moved them into a renovated cabin near the main house where she could supervise them directly. And then she looked at her sons. Jonathan was 19 years old, tall and lean with his father's serious demeanor. Samuel was 16, more volatile, quicker to anger. Both were young men of marriageable age in a community where eligible young women were scarce and required dowries Elizabeth could not afford. Both were bound to Willowmere by circumstance and family obligation. Both were, she realized, with cold calculation, tools she could use. The first conversation happened. Elizabeth called Jonathan into her study, the room where Marcus had once managed plantation business. She had been managing it herself for months by then, learning to read ledgers, to calculate yields, to make decisions about crop rotation and slave discipline. She discovered she was good at it, perhaps better than Marcus had been. She had a clarity he had lacked. She was not sentimental about tradition or reputation. She focused on results. "Jonathan," she said, closing the ledger she had been reviewing, "we need to discuss the future of Willowmere. You understand our financial situation." Jonathan nodded. His mother had been frank with him about the debt. He knew they were in danger of losing everything. "I have been considering how to increase our holdings without capital expenditure," Elizabeth continued. "The most efficient method is to grow our labor force through natural reproduction. But the natural rate is too slow. We need to accelerate it." She watched her son's face carefully as understanding dawned. Jonathan's expression shifted from confusion to comprehension to something that looked like physical illness. "Mother," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that we?" She cut him off. "I am suggesting that you understand your duty to this family, that you recognize the reality of our situation, that you participate in ensuring our survival. The women I have selected are healthy and fertile. The children they bear will belong to Willowmere, will increase our wealth, will secure our future." Jonathan stood up abruptly. "This is obscene. It is wrong. Father would never have allowed it. Your father is dead." Elizabeth's voice hardened. "Your father left us in debt. Your father's traditional methods were leading us toward bankruptcy. I am doing what is necessary to save this family, and you will help me or you will watch your sister starve when creditors take everything we own." The argument continued for hours, but Elizabeth Crane had already won. She knew her son's weak points: his sense of family duty, his fear of poverty, his lack of alternatives. Jonathan was a young man with no education beyond plantation life, no money of his own, no prospects beyond what Willowmere could provide. He was trapped and his mother knew it. Soon, Jonathan Crane had entered the cabin where Elizabeth kept her selected women. He had been assigned to a girl named Celia, 18 years old, born at Willowmere, strong from field work. Celia had been given no choice in the matter. She had been told that compliance meant better food, lighter work, safety for what family she had left. Resistance meant punishment, separation from her younger sister, possible sale to the deep south, where death came quickly in the cane fields. What happened in that cabin was not consent. It was not romance. It was not even the common brutality of masters taking enslaved women by force. It was something more coldly evil. It was organized, scheduled, recorded in ledgers with the same notation Elizabeth used for cotton yields and equipment maintenance. Jonathan came to the cabin on a schedule. Elizabeth tracked Celia's cycles to maximize chances of conception. When Celia became pregnant, Elizabeth noted it with satisfaction and moved Jonathan to the next woman on her list. Samuel was brought into the system. He was younger than Jonathan, more easily manipulated, and secretly relieved to have access to women without the social complications of courtship. Elizabeth recognized this about her younger son and used it. She presented the breeding program not as a moral compromise, but as a privilege, a natural right of ownership that he should exercise without guilt. Samuel accepted this narrative more readily than Jonathan ever had. Within 6 months, he had fathered children with 3 different women. Elizabeth's system was fully operational. The selected women lived in the supervised cabin. Jonathan and Samuel rotated among them on schedules Elizabeth maintained in her private ledger. Pregnancies were monitored carefully. Women received better food during pregnancy, lighter work, access to the plantation's medical supplies. These incentives were not kindness. They were Elizabeth's investment in inventory. A healthy baby was worth a fortune by age 12. A dead infant was just a loss of capital. The horror of Willowmere was not just in what Elizabeth did to the enslaved women, though that was horror enough. It was in how she corrupted her own sons, turning them into instruments of systematic rape, destroying whatever capacity for moral resistance they might have possessed. Jonathan began drinking heavily. He performed his assigned duties in the breeding program, but withdrew from all other aspects of plantation life. He rarely spoke at meals. He avoided his mother's eyes. He moved through Willowmere like a ghost, present but absent, alive but already dead inside. Samuel went in a different direction. He embraced the brutality. He convinced himself that enslaved women were fundamentally different from white women, that what he did in the cabin was not violation because his victims were not fully human. This lie protected him from guilt, but made him dangerous. He began taking women outside the official program, forcing himself on field workers, ignoring his mother's schedules in favor of his own impulses. Elizabeth tried to rein him in, not from moral concern, but from fear that his lack of control would create complications. But Samuel was learning what every enslaver eventually learned. Once you accept that some human beings are property, once you internalize that logic, there are no real limits to the cruelty you will justify. There was a woman named Bethany who watched all of this unfold. She had been at Willowmere since childhood, worked in the main house as a cook. Bethany could not read or write, but she had a sharp mind and a remarkable memory. She remembered which women were taken to the cabin and when. She remembered which children were born and who their fathers were. She remembered the conversation she overheard when Elizabeth thought the enslaved people around her were too ignorant to understand what was being discussed. Bethany began keeping mental records, building a testimony in her mind because written testimony was impossible. She noted dates and details. She memorized names. She created a structure of memory that would survive even if she did not because she understood something fundamental. This evil needed witnesses. Someone needed to remember what happened at Willowmere. Even if that memory had to be carried silently for years, even if justice seemed impossible. The act of remembering was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to let the horror be normalized and forgotten. In the spring, a girl named Sarah was selected for Elizabeth's program. She was 16 years old, and her selection broke something in the enslaved community at Willowmere. Sarah was the daughter of Jacob, a blacksmith who had been at the plantation for 20 years. Jacob had some small status among the enslaved people. He was skilled, valuable, treated marginally better than field hands. When Elizabeth's overseer came for Sarah, Jacob made a choice that would alter everything. He refused. Jacob's refusal came on a Tuesday morning. The overseer, a man named Garrett Mills, had arrived at the blacksmith shop where Jacob was repairing tools. Mills told Jacob that Sarah was needed at the main house. Jacob understood what that meant. Everyone at Willowmere understood what it meant when young women were summoned to the main house and did not return until morning. Jacob set down his hammer. He was a large man, his arms thick with muscle from years of forge work. He looked at Mills with an expression that contained everything he had swallowed for 2 decades. Rage, grief, exhaustion, and something harder. Something that looked like a decision being made in real time. No, Jacob said quietly. She ain't going. Mills stared at him. What did you say? I said no. Jacob's voice remained calm, but his hands had curled into fists. Sarah's my daughter. She's a child, and I ain't letting you take her to be used like that. I don't care what Mistress Crane wants. I don't care what you do to me. The answer is no. For a long moment, Mills seemed genuinely shocked. Enslaved people did not refuse direct orders. The entire system depended on compliance enforced by the certain knowledge of brutal punishment for resistance. Jacob's refusal was more than disobedience. It was a challenge to the fundamental logic of slavery itself. Mills reached for the whip he carried at his belt. Jacob grabbed a poker from the forge, iron still glowing red at one end. The two men faced each other in the doorway of the blacksmith's shop, both understanding that whatever happened next would be irreversible. Other enslaved people had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They watched in silence, frozen between hope and terror. Mills saw the crowd and recognized his disadvantage. One man with a whip against a blacksmith with a weapon and witnesses. He backed away slowly. This ain't over, he said. Mistress Crane will hear about this. Jacob knew what was coming. There were no victories for enslaved people, only choices about how to lose. He bought Sarah some time, maybe hours, maybe a day. But Elizabeth Crane would not tolerate defiance. The punishment would be severe, designed to terrify anyone else who might consider resistance. Jacob accepted this. Some things were worth dying for. Your child's innocence was one of them. Elizabeth learned about the incident within an hour. Her reaction was cold calculation rather than anger. Jacob's refusal represented a direct threat to her system. If one person could resist successfully, others would follow. She needed to make an example so brutal that no one at Willowmere would ever consider defiance again. But she also needed to preserve her valuable property. Jacob was a skilled blacksmith. Killing him would be a financial loss. She needed to break him without destroying his utility. What followed was a display of cruelty so precise it felt surgical. Jacob was taken to the plantation's punishment shed. He was stripped and bound to a post. Elizabeth did not order a whipping. Instead, she had Mills bring Sarah to the shed. She made the girl watch as two enslaved men, chosen under threat of punishment to their own families, were forced to brand Jacob. The iron was not heated in the forge Jacob had worked for decades. It was heated in a small fire built for the purpose. The brand was not the plantation's mark. It was a crude letter, R, for rebel, seared into Jacob's chest while his daughter screamed. Then Elizabeth made her point absolutely clear. She turned to Sarah. Your father's defiance has consequences. You will come to the main house tonight. And you will serve your purpose for Willowmere. If you refuse, your father will be sold tomorrow to a sugar plantation in Louisiana. You know what happens to men there. They are worked to death in a year. Your choice, child, your obedience or your father's life. Sarah looked at her father, his skin still smoking from the brand, his eyes filled with an agony worse than physical pain. She nodded silently. Jacob wept. That was the true victory for Elizabeth Crane. She had not just broken a rebellion. She had weaponized love itself, turning a father's protection into the instrument of his daughter's violation. She had demonstrated that resistance was not just futile but destructive, that the bonds of family could be used as chains. The system at Willowmere continued. The ledger entries multiplied. Children were born, listed as assets, their parentage noted in code. Elizabeth's debts began to be paid. The plantation survived. But something in the very air of Willowmere had turned toxic. The land itself seemed to carry the memory of what was happening. And through it all, Bethany remembered. She watched. She listened. She committed names and dates to memory. She could not write them down, but she built her own archive in her mind, a ledger of suffering that she swore she would one day speak, even if only to her own children, even if it took 100 years for the truth to find its way into the light. The doctor would eventually arrive in 1847, called to treat an outbreak of fever. He would see the cabin, the women, the children who all looked unsettlingly similar. He would hear fragments of stories from those too broken to stay silent. And he would sit in Elizabeth Crane's study, where she would proudly explain her system of managed increase as a business innovation. He would smile politely, write his medical notes, and then return to his lodgings in Selma, where he would open his personal journal and begin to write with a shaking hand, bearing witness to a horror he was powerless to stop, praying that someday, someone would read his words and remember.